When I started as a full-time speaker, Tony Robbins was 12 years old.
Talk about your impact you had on great speakers like Les Brown and Brian Tracy, because I know they're very famous speakers in the world. They blew up millions and tens of millions. And you actually, in this train, actually came before them, and yeah. you witnessed them grow, like Tony Robbins, same thing.
Yeah, same thing with Tony. When I started as a full-time speaker, Tony Robbins was 12 years old. So, we're talking serious.
That's perspective.
Yeah. So one day in Tampa at a National Speakers Winter Convention, I was on the shuttle going from the hotel after the convention back to the airport with some other speakers. And I was seated, and there's this guy standing up, hanging onto one of those little loops on the shuttle bus, and he said, "You're Jim Cathcart, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I try to be," and laughed. And he said, "Well, I'm Les Brown, and I'm going to be a famous motivational speaker." I said, "Really? Well, tell me about you." He said, "I'm going to my first paid speech." I said, "Get out of here. Seriously, you're going?" "Yeah." He said, I'm flying from Tampa to my first paid engagement as a professional speaker." And I said, "Wow, well, congratulations. And, be sure and apply all the ideas you got here, because it'll help shorten your path." Well, he not only went to that paid speech, he went on to fame and fortune and has made a profound impact in the world. And he was in Westlake Village, California about 3 years ago. And I signed up for his program and got in the audience. And I just sat there, didn't say anything. And he's up on stage being wonderful. And someone said, to one of the crew, they said, "Hey, get Mr. Brown a chair." And so I walked over and I said, "I'll help." And so I got this big old easy chair, and I walked up on stage with it, carrying this big thing, and walked up behind him and set the chair down. And he looked over and nodded to me, and then sat down in the chair and continued his speech. He hadn't noticed who I was. And then I went back out to the audience, and I just sat out there and listened and learned. And then he said, "Are there any questions?" And I said, "I have a question." He said, "Yes." And I said, "Hi, Les. My name's Jim Cathcart." He said, "Jim, is that you?" He said, "Oh my God, folks, I was on a shuttle bus and and he told the story. That was so cool. So cool. Brian Tracy was in Canada. He started his business up there, doing a series of seminars on the science of personal achievement. What do you call it? The psychology of achievement, like Dennis Waitley's psychology of winning. And Dennis heard me speak at a national speakers convention in New Orleans many years ago, like 1980. And Brian said, "Could I come to California and meet with you?" Well, sure. And I lived in La Jolla, San Diego, was partners with Tony Alessandra. And so we met at George's restaurant overlooking La Jolla Cove in a beautiful, picturesque setting. And Brian had brought Victor Risling, his lieutenant, with him. And they came from Canada, and they sat there with Tony and me. And he said, "So what's it like doing business here and living here in California and all that?" And I answered his questions as best I could. And so did Tony. He said, "Well, I'm going to do it." And so he went back to Canada and closed up shop and moved to California, became ultimately a US citizen, and went on. At one point, he even ran for governor back when Schwarzenegger got elected. Brian Tracy was one of the gubernatorial candidates that year.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, one of God knows how many, like 40 candidates. Of course, Brian has gone on to just travel the world and get a following of millions of people. I remember he used to do audio albums only and not books. And Tony and I had written a few books. And I said, "Brian, you really ought to write some books." "Nah, Jim, I'm into audio." And of course, now Brian's written more books than I have, and has done an amazing job with that. And he's still inspiring people to this day. I mean, he's been through all kinds of challenges. He had throat cancer. He recovered from that. He's all kinds of things, but he's still out there contributing great ideas.
So you've had this amazing influence on all these major influencers. I mean,
and the reverse is true. When I'm in their audience, I learn from them. I mean, Brian came over to our house for for parties, and I've been to his house, and we've spent lots of social time together, and so
Yeah, it's funny when the teacher becomes the student, the cycle just reverses. Yeah.
Or when the teacher and the student become peers. Like when I got to know Zig Ziglar, and we became no longer teacher and student, but equals. And when Og Mandino, my hero, who wrote the book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, and many others that sold tens of millions of copies, who was working at the time for W. Clement Stone, Og Mandino called me one day and said, "Jimmy, I need to ask you some questions. I need your advice." And I'm thinking,
awesome.
Wow. Wow. I mean, first off, that he had my phone number. Second, that he felt comfortable enough to call me Jimmy, which I don't even ask my friends to call me that. I'd rather they call me Jim. But anyway, wow. And I've been in his home, and I was with Og and Betty, his wife. And she said, "Jim, Og has your book in his desk." I said, "That's nice." She said, No. Og has your book in his desk. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Jim, don't you realize what I'm saying?" She said, Og Mandino, one of the greatest, most successful self-help authors in the history of the world, sold tens of millions of books. In his desk has about 3 books, one of which is the workbook you wrote for the W. Clement Stone audio program in 1976.
Wow.
And I said, wow.
Talk about full circle.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jim.